Let's see if this works. Everybody hear me okay? Yep. Okay. All right. My goals for today include not falling off the stage and not spilling my coffee. I'm not saying you guys are third or anything like that, but that's what I'm focused on at the moment. So my name's Todd Fine. I work for a company called WinElect. I'll tell you just a little bit about myself and the company in a minute. And today we're going to talk about Azure Functions. I wanted to do something a little real world with it, which is we are going to create an Azure function that monitors a storage account for incoming picture files. And anytime a picture file comes in, an image file comes into that storage account, we're going to pass it off to the computer vision API and analyze it for adult or inappropriate content. I'll explain how real world that is in a second, because it's basically happening all around us. Have any of you guys worked with Azure Functions so far? I'm just kind of curious. Maybe 5-10%, okay. I would actually be interested if you guys hang around or if we talk at the Q&A at the end to see what you're doing with it, because I've only started using them relatively recently. It's a fairly new feature within Azure, but I've been really surprised at the way that my developers and my company's actually using it. I initially thought of it as something that's, you know, the microservices terms used, the nanoservices terms used. It's a function, right? So you're thinking tiny little things going on. But even in this demo, I mean, we're going to pass something off and do, you know, vision analysis on it to basically a machine learning algorithm. So you can use it for all kinds of things that you've never maybe thought about. And one of the things I want to get you thinking about is, when you're architecting a solution, is an Azure function appropriate? And here's a new way that I can do things in a kind of microservices architecture. So that's kind of why I'm doing this talk. There's actually 2 or 3 reasons, which I'll kind of talk about as I go along. And I want to see how other people are using it too, because I just like to learn stuff. So let me tell you a little bit about, actually I don't have a slide myself. I don't like to talk about myself, but I've been developing, I mean, unofficially since I was a teenager, but officially in a host of different kind of contexts. I actually did some software development. I was a software manager for some electronic warfare systems way back for the US Navy. I wasn't in the military, I was a civilian, but that was some really fun stuff. It's still out there around the world in ships and planes. And most of the stuff that I've been doing for the last 20 years, or all of it, has been probably what you guys are doing, line of business applications, you know, building software for either my internal companies or corporations, or in my case, for external customers. So that's WinElect. I mean, we're a software development and training company. If you don't know us, we've won lots of little awards and things like that. I won't go into it. But if you do know us, for the people in this room, you probably know us through this, all the books that have been written by our owners and employees over the years. Some of them are the more well-known names, like Jeffrey Richter and John Robbins, who was the Bug Slayer columnist and MSDN, that kind of a thing. So that's how most people know us, even though training's only about 20% of our revenue, but that's kind of where the name came from. So before I get started, I wanted to show you where you can get all the code and all the resources for this presentation, and I'll put this up again at the end during Q&A. What you're looking at is 2 or 3 public GitHub repos. So there's 2 or 3 reasons or ways that this talk came about. One of them is that as WinElect, as the company, and in my other role as a Microsoft RD, which is like Microsoft MVP, I do not work for Microsoft at all. We build a lot of stuff for Microsoft and Microsoft's customers. So that first one, and I'm going to show you this GitHub repo a little later on when we have to deploy something to Azure, and it takes about a minute or 2, and there's a delay, so I'll bring it up. But we build a lot of training, workshops, actual code, actual products for Microsoft. This talk was originally built for Microsoft Research. That's what MSR stands for there. And actually, I'll show you this here right now. These lights make it a little hard for me to see. So here's a couple of those repos. This is the one for MSR, Microsoft Research. This is one for Microsoft Technical Community. This stuff was actually built for MSR to target data scientists and universities worldwide to get them up on Azure to do workshops, and you know, not like a training class, but like jumpstart workshops, go in these universities, talk to these data scientists, to be honest, win the hearts and minds of data science people around the world. The charter came down from very high up at Microsoft saying, you know, you remember the 80s when Apple won the education war and Apple's Macintoshes and were all over education and schools everywhere, and Microsoft just lost out. don't let that happen again with data science. We want to win the war, and they're just devoting a lot of money to it. So the reason I'm bringing this up, which isn't directly related to the talk, but you can see that the Azure Functions, which one is this I'm looking at? Okay, is over here. All this stuff is absolutely free, okay? It's there for you to use. Microsoft isn't advertising it. We built it for Microsoft's technical resources. They're using it when they go out and talk to customers, and we built it for Microsoft's customers or targets that they're going in enterprises. It's all free, but it's not advertised anywhere. If you look at any of these topics and go, oh, I'd like to learn about it, I'll guarantee you that it's a better way to do it than just looking online at the various sites and finding like a little 10-minute video from the Microsoft Azure site about Azure Functions. Each of these is a little 1-hour workshop that steps you through in great detail how to do it. It's really well done. And I'll show you an example of it when we have to sit around for a minute or two and wait for something to deploy. But I just wanted to kind of give you that to help out, because it's very useful. Our guys use it all the time whenever they want to learn something new that's in there. There's about 40 of them so far. Okay. So I mentioned that this talk came about a few ways. One of them was because we were working with Microsoft Research and trying to figure out what kind of topics we wanted to hit. The other way is this is real. It happened a few months back. We use Slack internally for our internal messaging system, and the developers are always just talking about the latest JavaScript framework or whatever the current thing of the day is. And they were all discussing something about JavaScript, the philosophy of coding and JavaScript and functions and all this kind of stuff. And suddenly I see this pop up. It's from one of my colleagues, and he said, I posted this link to Facebook on this JavaScript article and immediately received a notification that it was removed for inappropriate content because it had nudity. Okay, so now I'm obligated to say why my colleague posted nudity. It was the cover of a JavaScript book, but it had think of like a Greek or Roman statue, that kind of nudity. So just so you know, he wasn't posting pornography to Facebook. But within seconds, it came down. So how does that happen, right? There's not hordes and hordes of Facebook people looking at the billions of posts and all the images and deleting them. It's got to be automated. It's got to be some kind of algorithm or machine learning process that looks at images and figures out if they're appropriate or not, or tries to, and does a bad job in this case, believe it or not, because it's a book that's published. And that's exactly what we're going to build today. And you're going to see how crazy simple it is. I'm old enough, as you can tell, that I still have this instinct when I have to build something to go, okay, I'm going to create a big project, I'm going to create an app, and I'm going to do all this stuff. What we're starting to see is you don't have to do that. You have these microservices options available to you, different kinds of components, and Azure Functions is a great one. So what we're going to do is create this simple little Azure function, no app, no ASP.NET project, no worker roles. We're just going to stick a little function up that does what we want and do all this in a tiny, tiny bit amount of code. So this was a perfect example when we were talking to Microsoft Research and going, what topics we'll hit. We wanted Azure Functions. They're all about cognitive services and artificial intelligence now, right? We said, hey, let's just repeat this. So that's what we're going to build today. That's part of the inspiration for this talk. So what are Azure Functions? Just so you know, I'm going to probably do about 10, 15 minutes of slides, and then no more slides. It's going to be just building this whole demo the rest of the time. So Azure Functions are just small pieces of reusable methods. Just think of it exactly like it probably pops in your mind. I'm going to take a function or a method. I just want to do that. I want to stick it in the cloud and be able to call it. But because it's on the cloud, right, I can scale it, I can manage it. It's got the hosting environment. You can do all these things with it, and you don't have to create any kind of complicated framework or app. So they use the term serverless all the time because you're not building these services around it. You're not kind of hosting it in ASP.NET or anything. You're just sticking it on the cloud. They use nano services because I guess they already use microservices, so now they have to call it something else. But to me, it's just microservices. It's just another way to do things, put a bunch of methods up or functions up that do explicit things. And you only pay for the time that this code is executing. That can be different. I'm not an expert on Google and AWS, but what I've seen is that some of the other platforms have kind of tiers of service you buy. Like you buy this tier, and you pay for it as long as it doesn't go beyond X level. That's what you pay. Then you pay for the next tier. On Azure, it's just time slicing. It's like going back to the 70s. It's just paying for whatever time slices you're using on this function. So it's pretty cheap. It supports any language you could possibly want, almost. JavaScript, Python, C#, PowerShell, Bash, everything. But to me, the more important thing is that I don't want to call it integration, because integration sounds like you're glomming a bunch of stuff together. I guess I'll call it interoperation or interop. It can trigger on almost anything, and that's part of the value, right? You have to be able to trigger this function on almost anything you want, easily. And you're going to see how easy it is when we do the demo. So you can trigger it on basically any event within Azure. You can have functions interoperate with each other. You can trigger it on third-party apps like, I don't know, OneDrive or Dynamics, things like that. And it's got all these templates that you'll see in a second. So it's got a pretty rich tooling set, even though it's fairly new, and that tool set is kind of expanding greatly, quickly, I should say. So what are some common scenarios? I could probably do 3 pages of them. Timer-based processing, when you're doing kind of cleanup, you just want something to execute every once in a while. Event processing, real-time streaming. I mean, we're going to do something, it's not really streaming, right? It's going to trigger every time an image file hits a storage container. But I talked to somebody, I'm wondering if he's here, somewhere in the audience, that we had like the beer garden thing a couple days ago. And he said, well, we're doing something similar. We're streaming real-time video from drones and analyzing that. So you can use Azure Functions for that as well. The last one I put on there because about 4 weeks ago, I was sitting in, we called it a war room with a Microsoft sales team. We had 3 days to put the POC together for the city of Atlanta in the US. And because it's Microsoft, and I should say because it's salespeople, I guess, they're the same kind of everywhere. They wanted to throw the kitchen sink at this POC. We had 3 days to do it. So there was a list like this. And the day before, they started going, well, you know, DevTools, we want to sell DevTools. Can we get a Xamarin app as part of this? And we're like, sure, we'll write a Xamarin app tonight. And then the final one was, well, let's get bots in there too, you know, because that probably gives them even more money if the city of Atlanta does bots. So we were like, I don't know if we have time to do a bot service for this. And I'm talking with my Azure architect, and he goes, you know, I can do it. I'm just going to write a quick Azure function that calls on the bot service and does X, Y, Z. And I never would have thought of that, you know, even a year ago. I'm going to write an app to do this or a service to do this. But no, you can do almost anything with these Azure functions. And the way to trigger the bot service I won't get into, but it was just, you know, how are we going to tell it when to come in? And it was like nothing. You just create this template, boom, and you go off, and you'll see that. So it is really flexible. I keep mentioning these templates. I, so far, have never, like, from the ground up, written an Azure function, meaning, like, started a project. Part of it is because the portal doesn't require you to yet. You'll see when we do the Azure function that says, what kind do you want? And it kind of gives you some Chrome around it, some little tiny framework. And when I say framework, I just mean a couple files with some starter code. But you're going to see 1 or 2 screens that just says, tell me what language you want, tell me what kind of trigger you want, tell me what kind of function you want, and you click it, and then all you got to do is fill in the function. And you can see on the right all the different kinds of stuff you can do, and that just expands. I won't say daily, but it's kind of expanding continuously. GitHub webhooks, HTTP trigger, Q triggers. You can see at the top, we're going to do a blob trigger, and there's much more that you can do. So there's 3 main categories, or the way Azure is kind of grouping them, of Azure functions. I don't necessarily agree with these, the way they've done it, but it's really just informational. The first one's timer function apps that run at intervals or manually, or whatever you want. Usually you're using cron expressions to kind of specify how it's going to run or when it's going to run. That can be used for anything, of course, but people usually use it for, you know, cleanup, data management, checking for state, monitoring something, that kind of a thing. The second is the one we're going to do, which is data processing stuff, run when it's triggered by some kind of data event. And that's much more kind of normal for probably the people in this room, right? You're always dealing with some kind of data and you have to do something to it or with it. So it's great for CRUD events, create, read, update, delete. We're going to use it for moving content because we're going to take these image files and do something with them depending on what the computer vision API says. You can access data across services. You're not limited to some little tiny, you know, container or box that you have to live in. It's made to work across all your Azure services. And these have in and out parameters because there's a piece of data, so you can kind of pass that name in and out. And the last kind of expands things greatly because you have webhook and API functions. So now you can talk to other services. You can, again, interop with GitHub or TFS or OneDrive, all that kind of stuff. Now, I haven't done anything personally with that, but my developers have, and it's going to be just as easy as what you're going to see in the demo. So again, I didn't want to go into detail on this. I'd rather just show you stuff. But we can kind of loop back around at the end if you guys have questions. And again, everything you see, from the PowerPoint deck to the demo script to the images to the code, is all available on those GitHub repos. So what does a function look like? It's really a collection of 4 things. There's a run method or a run file that contains the Azure function. So you're going to see that in the code. There's a function app you create, but that function app can have 1 or more functions in it. So we're only going to create 1 function, but you can have 2, 3, 4, whatever you want. So there's a function file containing the bindings, and you'll see that as well. We're going to have 1 binding to a blob storage container. Then there's a project file, which you can have, that has to specify dependencies, right? We're going to have a dependency on the Azure Storage, so we're going to have 1 little tiny project.json file. And then there's the app settings. So we're going to hit every one of these, but that's way overstating what we're going to do, because it's going to take us almost no time, except for that run file, to just show you 3 lines of code and go, oh, here's the binding, here's the project file. It's that simple. And I only included this for completeness so that if you guys ever want the deck, you can have the slide. There's no reason for me to go into it. But this kind of shows you what kind of triggers you can have for the various types of Azure functions. So we're going to do Blob Storage. You can see there's a trigger for that. It has an input, it has an output, that kind of thing. This is really just extra information for anybody that wants to look at this deck. So how do you test it? I have 2 answers for you. The first answer is what you see on the screen. Command line tools, curl. What we're going to do to test it is we're just going to upload a bunch of files into this storage container and see if it works. But you can, so we're going to use Azure Storage Explorer. We're just going to really use File Explorer. There's all kinds of ways you can test it. But in the fall, or even now, if you have the preview, this is not the current Visual Studio preview. It's the fall preview that's coming out, version 15.3, if you're going online looking for it. They're building all this functionality finally into Visual Studio, so all that tooling is in there. And then you can just do a function app project, which you can't do now. It doesn't show up. And you can pre-compile it, and you can do testing, and you can do 1-click deploy it to the cloud, all that kind of stuff. It's not in Studio now, but it will be in the fall, and you can actually get the preview already. So the extent I've played with this is downloading the preview, going, okay, there's a new project file type, and yeah, it does what it said it does, and I just wrote a hello world thing and published it, and it worked. I'm like, okay. We're going to do everything in this demo in the portal. So just to remind you what we're going to do again today, and I'm going to show you a visual of it in a second, we're going to create an Azure Function app with 1 function in it. That function will be bound to a blob storage container and just monitor it for incoming files, image files, JPEGs to be specific. Every time it sees an image file, it's going to take that, turn it into a byte array, pass it off to the Cognitive Services Computer Vision API, and that the settings on that computer vision call will be set to say, check it for adult content, check it for racy content. Sometimes that slang goes weird in different countries, but inappropriate but not really, really bad. Is it, how bad is it type of thing. It'll actually score it, and I'm going to log some metadata so we can see kind of what the computer vision API did. So accepted images will be moved from the original blob container to an accepted blob container, and the rejected images will go to a rejected blob container. So I just realized last night, when I've had this up there, I've done this talk like 5 times, that that's completely wrong. Because what's happening here is, here's the function app with 1 function in it, and that's going to monitor this blob container called uploaded. Here's the image files coming in. When it sees it, the function app triggers and passes that file off to the Cognitive Services API. All that's correct. The problem is, in just this visual, if it's accepted, it goes to the accepted container. If it's rejected, it goes here. It's not the Cognitive Services app that's doing that. It's this Azure function. I drew it wrong months and months ago and never noticed till last night. And nobody, because usually you guys are pretty good. Usually you guys are always telling us like what we're doing wrong, and it's actually helpful. I actually welcome it, but nobody noticed it. So I'm sure I've done other things wrong. Feel free to yell out. I've heard that Norwegians don't do that, but I want you to. Go for it. Let's do this demo. And I'll probably have, because I always like to lower the bar a little bit when I'm doing these things. Let me go back to this, because I'm going to come back to this visual a couple times. And we don't need this anymore. We're going to come back here. So some things that have happened with this demo is, and you'll see it in the code, because I've commented out some code lines, is there's some strange things going on with cognitive services sometimes. They're moving its location from data center to data center. So about 3 weeks ago, I did this talk in Brussels. And somebody else who's another famous speaker, I mean, I didn't know, he's in a different city in the US doing the same talk. And if this demo doesn't work, it doesn't blow up. It's just at the very end when we do all this stuff and I go, and look, just nothing happens. It's just a blank screen. That's all that happens. Because something went wrong with either a data center latency or things like that. So what they had done is they had moved the endpoint for the computer vision API from West US data center to West Central US. But they'd not told anybody. So me and another speaker had done this talk. It didn't work at all. And that evening, we get back to the hotel. It was not a good day, you know. And we get this long email from Microsoft going, I'm so sorry. We moved the data endpoint, and we didn't change any of the documentation, and we didn't tell anybody. And, you know, what can you do? But so strange things have happened. I did this literally 15 minutes before this talk to make sure that didn't happen again, but you never know, because we're going to be talking to different data centers. So let's get going. How much time do we have? All right, this is not a long demo. You're going to get some free time at the end of this. It usually takes about 20 minutes. So you're going to have free networking time after this. So I'll blow this up a little bit. The first thing we're going to do, right, is we're going to create a new function app. So you go to New. This is the new Azure portal, or the current Azure portal, I should say. Compute, and usually down at the bottom, there's Function app. By the way, the other thing that happened once to me, you guys probably already know this, is one time I did this and it wasn't there. And the audience was helpful, and they said, hey, so they don't include everything there. There's this new link, see all. And that's where it was. But it was always there, and then it wasn't, and it's the first thing I do. You know, I guess I shouldn't tell you all the ways I've screwed up all my previous presentations. So I just said new function app. And let's call this Func app NDC, and what's the date? 616, so just to have a unique name. And I don't want to do it like that. 616, Func app NDC 616. I'm going to use my Visual Studio subscription. We're going to create a new resource group for this. Now, for those of you who don't know Azure or what a resource group is, at a high level, it's just a way to combine everything in your Azure thing that you're doing, all your resources, into one group so you can manage it all at once. If you have something that's using 20 different types of Azure components and you want to delete it, you don't want to go in and find them all and delete them. You just want to say, I want to delete my thing. So this is going to combine everything that we're using, which isn't much, into a resource group with this name. Now, there's a couple ways to host this, these hosting plans. I've included extra slides in here, again, for anybody that downloads the slide deck to explain what these are, but basically it's just different pricing plans. Depending on how you're using it, you know, how often it's being called, what it's doing, there's different ways to consume it or host it that charge you, like one uses VMs and one doesn't, that kind of a thing. So I'm just going to use what's called a consumption plan. Let's try West Europe. And I'm going to let it create a new storage account. That's what this is. We don't need application insights. I'm going to pin this to the dashboard. To try to make sure I didn't screw up any of this. Func app, resource group, consumption plan, West Europe. This is the stuff that's important. Now, for cognitive services, I'm going to have to use West US, at least last time I checked. So let's create that. Should switch over to the dashboard and start deploying. This takes a minute or two. So what I thought I would do for this minute or two is go back over to these GitHub repos. So I mentioned that all the stuff's in there. Here's functions. I didn't show you what's in it, but I pulled this down because this is what I'm doing my talk from, so you can see it here. This is exactly from the GitHub repo with a couple extra decks in it that I put together for different conferences. So it's got the deck, it's got the code for it, it's got any resources you need, everything's here. It also has an HOL, a hands-on lab, or a demo script. So you can see that most of these we do in multiple languages. Sometimes it's Python or R. This one was built in both C# and JavaScript. And let's just kind of put that down so we can watch the background. And it's also in different, I guess I would say, formats. So we have an HTML, we have a Markdown file. Let me just show you what this looks like if you guys decide you want this or any of those other workshops. So this is basically, if you're doing a training session with people that you want to do like a hackathon or something, then it's a hands-on lab, right? If you want to go to your local user group or your company and say, let me show you this stuff, then it's a demo script. But this I'll call it a demo script. It has everything that I'm doing in here. It's very detailed. It's got every screenshot of everything. There you go, what I just did. But it also explains it so you can learn. It's not meant to be like a formal class, but we want people to understand it. So there's explanations all along the way of what you're doing and why in all these hands-on labs or demo scripts. So I'm going to get rid of that because I can see that it has deployed in the background. And here's our function app, our running function app. So now we have done step 1, which is just this blue box. We haven't done the yellow box. So you might think the next thing I'm going to do is create the function app, but instead I'm going to create these 3 containers and get that out of the way. So here's our function app. Let's go to the dashboard. I'm actually going to pin this resource group to the dashboard too, so we can all get to it all easily. So let's go and pin that to the dashboard. Not doing anything real yet. That's the resource group. Here's the function app. And this function app has this resource group has our Func app, it's got our hosting plan, and it's got our storage account. That's what that is, the storage account. I love horizontal scrolling. It's just a great idea. So let's go over, now I have a lot of complaints I've given to Microsoft about the new Azure portal, but it actually is getting better and better. I'm actually on the verge of liking it. But one thing I really do like is this storage account view, because it really consolidates all your storage, your Azure Storage stuff in one place, queues and tables and files. So we're going to go to these blobs, our Blob Storage account. There's nothing in it. We're going to create these 3 containers. The first one was called uploaded. And you can do different kind of access types for a container, but we're just going to leave it private. So we have the uploaded container, spelled correctly. Another way that I can screw up this presentation, not saying I did. If any of you guys saw the Spectacular Failures talk yesterday, I was like, oh, I got a story. They should let me up there, but they had it all pre-set up. So we got an accepted container, so uploaded, accepted, one more. We'll do rejected. And now we have our 3, 1, 2, 3 spelled correctly containers. So the next thing, so now we're, just to keep coming back to this, now we've created this blue box. We've created each of these blue rectangles. Now we can finally create our Azure function. So let's do that. So now we're going to go over to our function app. And the way you create a new, here's our function app here. The way you create a new function is just to click on this, the plus sign. And now you start to see these templates. So there's a few ways you can do this. You can kind of do these remember these big 3 categories, timing, timer, data processing, webhook, and that really does everything for you almost and kind of gives you a little wizard. You can also pick all these languages, C#, JavaScript, F#. If you see down here, you can do it in PowerShell or Bash or anything that you want. We're going to do a custom function because I want to have something to demo here. So I'm going to click on this and create our own custom function. And you still get a lot of help. Look at all these templates. Do you want to hook into GitHub? Do you want to do a generic webhook? Do you want to do an HTTP trigger, a queue trigger, a timer trigger? We want to do a blob trigger. And again, I can also pick my language. So let's just do a blob trigger in C#. And it asks you for just a few parameters. So let's call ours blob image analysis. And it's asking for a path. So what's it mean by path? Here's what it means. It'll be obvious when I type it in. The path that we're looking at is that to that uploaded container, and the parameter is the file name. That's the in parameter for it. So uploaded, that's just the format they use. Uploaded/name as the input parameter. We don't have to worry about that. Should be good to go. Blob image analysis uploaded, boom. And this shouldn't take that long, maybe 10 seconds or so, not even that. Okay, so now you have your run function. This is your function. There's some other files I'll show you in a second. And this is just, obviously nothing's in it. It's your template, and you type in what you want to do. So I have some code here, 2 little pieces of it. Now, audiences are weird. Sometimes they say you're faking it unless I'm typing in every line of code, but the purpose is not for you to watch me type. The purpose is to see how an Azure function works. So let me take you through this. I put a lot of comments in so that you guys can see it if you're downloading the repo. So here's our run function. That is basically what is run when the function is triggered. And that's called every time, because we have a binding to a blob storage. I'll show you that in a minute. Every time a file comes into that blob storage container, the uploaded container, this run function runs. And all this is doing is using a helper function called analyze image async. I'll show you that in a second. So it turns that image file into a byte array and passes it off to this helper function. Everything else you see here is really just some log info that I put in. And after it gets the result back from the computer vision API, it takes that and says, look, did it come back as adult content? All right, put it in the rejected container. Did it not? Everything's okay? Put it in the accepted container. That's all you're seeing here. So again, here's this function that calls the computer vision API. Let's look at that. It's right below. It's right here. So it takes in an application setting, which I'll talk about again later. That's so you can call into the Cognitive Services API. It needs an API key. And this is the call. It's right here. This is really the one line of code that does it all. And this isn't a Cognitive Services talk. Those talks are also in the GitHub repo if you want to kind of learn about that. But basically, you have one call that is calling into the Cognitive Services API and asking it, is this file okay or not? So you can see my previous talks that messed up is when they moved West US to West Central US and didn't tell anybody. So I have another one in here just to show you guys that you have to call into the right data center at the moment. They're expanding it to the data centers around the world, but for the moment, it's not everywhere. So I'll show you why I still have this commented out West US thing in here in a minute. And the rest of it, which isn't very long, there's only about 100 lines of code here total, is just some helper functions to move those blobs around and put some blob metadata in there. If I didn't do that, this would be half the size. It'd be about 50 lines of code, which is mostly comments and white space anyway. So you can see there's just not much here, putting some metadata in there, changing that image file into a byte array, and here's some classes. There's really almost nothing here. So I will select all this. And we will stick it in here. And I'll push save. So you could say you can see it's its own kind of little almost development environment that it has. And again, once Visual Studio comes out in the fall, the preview's out there right now, you'll be able to do all this within the Visual Studio environment. But we've obviously done all of our stuff right here in this portal. So there is something else we have to do. You can look at the rest of your project files here. This is the run file that we just did. Let's add another file. And I'll show you what this is. I'm sure you've heard of this file before. Project.json. What are we going to put in there? That's my one other tiny little piece of code. We have to tell it the project dependency on Azure Storage. So that's all that's in here. We'll get rid of that. We'll stick this in here. I'll click Save. So we have our run file that you've seen. We have our project file. What's this? This is that third thing. Remember I showed you, so you have almost every component of this little function that I showed you now, this little file, slide. You have the executable code, you have the .NET Core and project references, the function configuration I'm going to show you now, and then the app settings I'll show you right after. Let's go back to this slide, because this is pretty much all built now. So what is this function.json, that third thing? There's your binding. And you can see it's a blob trigger, that's the type. it's got an input parameter, and the path is this uploaded name. Exactly what we stuck in the in that little template description when it asked us for it. So let's go back here. Everything's saved. We should be good to go, except for one thing. Right down, where is it here? It's asking, we have to get an application setting. We need an API key to call into Cognitive Services, just like you do with anything in Azure, or I'm sure AWS, that kind of thing. You have to have a key that says you're allowed to go in and call this thing. There's a couple ways to get that key. The first one, so remember this, my demo fail, West Central US, West US. So in the slide, sorry I'm jumping around, I gave you this URL here. You can get your API key here. That's not how we're going to do it for this demo. I'll explain why in a second. But if you guys don't have an Azure account, and you're like, this is pretty cool, but I'm not really into this, or I'm an AWS guy, I don't want to take the time, I don't want to give Microsoft a password or whatever, you can go right to this site, here's the URL, and you can play with all these Cognitive Services APIs. So you just go right to this site, you click create, it's going to ask me to log in, I'm not going to, well, I'll go do this. I'm not going to bother to log in, but you log in with, you don't even have to even create a new password. You can use your Facebook one or LinkedIn one. And then it just gives you a free account for a while and gives you an API key as part of it. It's a very simple screen. There's not much to do. But then you can start playing with it without having to set up any kind of an Azure account. So I'm not going to do this. Here's the key, though. If you use this URL and you use this free account, you must use West Central US. That's what they moved when my demo didn't work. I was using that website for the key. It'll give you a key, you stick it in application settings, which you'll see me do, and make sure you use West Central US. But we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it a different way, because we want to make this a production-ready system, supposedly, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to add the computer vision API to our Azure resource group, to the stuff that we're working on. So I'm going to go new, AI and Cognitive Services, and right at the top you see Computer Vision API. And now we have to create a new one of this, Vision, let's call it Vision app, NDC 616. Use my subscription. This is key. This is where I messed up before. I'm going to use West US. Because I have to use West US, because that endpoint, remember in the code, which I can't flip to now, actually I can flip to it here. This is the Cognitive Services call. It's at West US, so you want it in West US. Pricing tier, there's a couple different pricing tiers to use. I'm going to use the cheap one for this demo. This time for the resource group, I want to use the one we're already using. I want it all together. So I'll say Func App Resource Group. The little signature thing it needs. So West US, this is the important part right there. I'll pin this to the dashboard. I'll create it. And this should only take 15 or 20 seconds, so I'm not going to go into anything else. There you go. So that worked. The only reason I did this was to get this access key, so I can call into my Vision app, which I just put in my same resource group, so everything I have is all together. So I'm going to click on this little link for the access key, and I'll show you the last way that this demo blew up on me. I'm going to copy this key, and because I have ADD and I can't really focus, easily, I'm either completely focused for 18 hours and coffee, staying up all night like we all do coding, or I'm just totally, a mess. I never noticed this little message that says, notice, when you generate these keys, they might take up to 10 minutes to take effect. So that got me on a demo. I was going through it really fast, and then it just didn't work. Didn't give me any error, it just didn't work. And only later did I notice the little notice that says right. It has to be red and blinking for me to notice something like that. So if this demo doesn't work, it's going to be because of that thing right there, because I don't want to make you wait 10 minutes. But 9 times out of 10, it works fine. And I don't want to bash Microsoft. It's nothing to do with Microsoft. It's just we're trying to do a demo instead of something in production, and we're being careful about it. But I copied this key, and that was the entire reason I created this Vision app. So let's go to our Function app. and set that application setting. So how do I do that? This is our function app. Here's our function that we just built. There's a couple ways to put in settings. The one that says settings, where you'd think it would go, is really just the most basic stuff. There's almost nothing there. But when you go to platform features, you get this rich set of tooling, or not tooling, but settings that you can do for deployment slots and proxies and custom domains and all kinds of stuff. We're going to go to application settings. Let me just bring this code up one more time so you can see exactly what I'm doing. We're going here. We're going to get an application setting. It's called subscription key. That's the name we gave it in the code. So I'm going to scroll down here to app settings. And we're going to call this subscription key. And we're going to put in that key that we copied. Subscription key. And we'll save it. And I'll just save that up to the cloud. It usually takes about 15 seconds. Usually. There you go. All right, let's close that. So if I go back to this Azure function, oh, this is another thing that's interesting. So if you do this, well, I just keep going on with my stories, don't I? So did you see that when I brought it up, it just was a blank screen for a bit? Sometimes that will be like that for 30 seconds, and you go, everything, I just lost all my work. It's just grabbing it back from wherever it's stored in the data center, and sometimes it's instant, sometimes it's not. So there is a log file down here that you can see that you can click run and test this out, which I guess I could do, but I'm not going to bother to do that right now. But it'll compile it, and you can see if there's any errors in there. Since I know I did everything perfect, right, I'm just not going to bother to do that. And now we're done. We've done this entire thing here. We have our 3 Blob containers. We created our vision app. We have our function app with 1 function in it. All we have to do is test it out. So how are we going to test it out? Let's make sure all these files are still here. That looks good. This was built for us. We have this. All right. Yeah, I was waiting for it. Usually it just sits there and runs this thing. Let's try to run it and see what happens. Nothing. Okay, hold on. The reason it's showing an exception typically is because there's no file for it to get. So I made it run, and there's no file for it to get because we haven't done anything yet. So we're probably okay. Let's just test this thing out. How are we going to test it? We're going to go over to our Blob Storage again. Let me refresh this screen so you can see our resource group. So now you can see that our vision app's part of our resource group. Let's go back over to our storage. To our blobs. To our uploaded container. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload some image files. Let me show you what these image files look like. So there's 9 files. Some of them have no people in it. Some have people in it. Some have people with a little skin showing. A slightly funny thing that happened when I first saw this, the same colleague who put that little Slack message up about the nudity did this talk the first time with just the woman. And I said to him, you can't go into these conferences and just show that the potentially racy thing is a woman in a bikini. You can't just do that, which he still does. So I added the guy, because this is a gender-neutral presentation that I'm doing here. But when you think about the score, this could be offensive in a Muslim country or something like that. You just never know. So you got to be a little careful. So I decided to be equally, I don't know if it's careful or equally offensive or not. But the idea, if I didn't screw anything up, let me just move this back here to large icons. There's 9 image files here. Two of them, and they're image 3 and image 3B, potentially could be offensive to somebody, depending on, I guess who you are. But that's the kind of thing that if you could post on a public website or Facebook, that they might go, hey, what are you doing? And this automated machine learning algorithm will take it away or give you a warning. So I'm going to upload those files to this uploaded container, okay? Here they are. Let's go open. Now here's the first moment of truth. So when I click upload, sometimes this is instant, sometimes there's a little latency, but you shouldn't see a bunch of errors. If you see a bunch of errors, either I did something wrong or some weird data center thing's going on, because we're talking to West Europe and we're talking to West US. Let's find out. Boom, 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 boom. That's a good sign. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. So we got all of these pictures up there in the uploaded container, right? They're here. That Azure function should have triggered 9 times, passed it off to the computer vision API, and done something with it. So just so you know what happens when this demo doesn't work, it's this. Nothing happens at all. You just go look, and then there's no errors, there's nothing. You're trying to figure out what went wrong. Let's go over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's good. So at this point, I actually know the whole thing worked. Because what it did is it triggered on each one of these, and there's 7 of them that are probably okay, and there's 2 of them that might not be, right? So there's 7 files there. Let's look at the rejected folder. And it's 3, and it's 3B. So it all worked. Now, how did it score? I mean, what did it actually do? We did write that. We had that log metadata. We wrote metadata to the blob file. Let's go over here, and I'll tell you what. We will close all this down. Close all this down. Let's go to Azure Storage Explorer. So here is our Azure Storage blob container. Hopefully you guys can see that. Here's our Azure Storage account. Here's our blob container. Here's our rejected folder. Double click on it. There's our 2 files. I'm looking right into my Azure Storage account. So let's look at what these are. So there's 3 and there's 3B, because I have one more funny thing to say. 3 is the woman, 4 is the man, right? Let's look at the man first. So you can click on this, go properties, and I know this is a little hard to see, so I'll read it for you. And here's that metadata that I wrote, just to remind you, because I always like to associate the code. This is that little helper function where whenever it wrote a blob that was rejected, I put some metadata in here because I wanted to see how it was scored. So what you see is, this is for the man. Is it adult content? No. What's the adult content score or adult score? Only 2%. Definitely not pornographic or anything, right? Is it racy? It looks like it could be racy. The racy score is 45% for the man, right? Let's see what the woman is. And I think this is kind of funny. Oh, there it is. Okay. Is it adult? No. She scored slightly higher. Instead of 2%, it's 15%. Is it racy? 87%. So I want you to look at these pictures now. And I want you to ask yourself, just for fun, what's that computer vision machine learning algorithm doing? Because obviously the man has more skin showing, but he's not inappropriate really hardly at all. But the woman in the bikini is twice as inappropriate, according to this algorithm, as her. So there's definitely some sexism going on in this cognitive services API. But anyway, I want to kind of end, and I'll post those URLs. I want to kind of end, going back to our portal for a second. And I'm not trying to make this any kind of revolutionary thing, but I never would have thought of doing something like this in a quick Azure function. But if all you want to do is, hey, there's image files, I want to do something with it. In the past, I always would have written an app to do it, or I would have written a service to do it, or worker roles to process it. But all I want to do is say, image file, do something. This is totally appropriate, but it's doing a big chunk of stuff in the background. You can now scale it, manage it, do deployment slots with it, do proxies, monitoring. You can do all the stuff you can do with Azure to manage and scale. You can do different consumption plans and stick it in a VM. You can do all this stuff because it's on the cloud. And all you're doing is sticking a stupid little function up there in that run algorithm. And now you have a different kind of way of doing a Microsoft services architecture. You're not doing some big service fabric app, which is, everything's appropriate in its context and for its purpose. But this is a real different way of doing, I would say, microservices, and we're starting to use it more and more and more as people are just getting used to the fact that, oh, this is a different way to do it. It's new to me, I'm not sure yet, and we're using it in major architectures more and more. So I would encourage you to check it out and just learn about it and see if it's something you can start to add to your toolkit, because the world is going this way in a lot of ways. In AWS, they call them lambdas. It's a big thing. It's evolving rapidly, and it's now something that's a part of every architecture discussion we have is, hey, do we want to do X or Y with an Azure function? So let me just post this, this slide again so you can see it, and we still have 10 minutes left. So any questions for me about anything at all relating to this? And I can't really see that well, but okay.
Just wondering, what do you think of the maturity of like tools and DevOps and all this versioning of functions? Do you think it's baked yet? Or?
So you are talking about, so the question was what I think of the tooling around, I guess, various things, versionings and DevOps and Azure Functions. Do you want me to talk specifically to Azure Functions or just in general?
No, Azure Functions.
Okay, because DevOps, we're a big DevOps shop, and I love that tooling. So the Azure Functions, I mean, as you can see, I think two things. One is that portal, that screen that I showed you with where I did the app settings and it shows the function app. Literally a month and a half ago, that was not, it didn't look anything like that. There wasn't even a menu across the screen. It's the same thing. I didn't tell you every story of my panic for this demo, but literally the day before a demo, I went to that screen and all my app settings were gone. They were like, where do you get app settings? And I called, my colleagues like, oh, now you go here. That was just, there's no announcements for this. So my frustration with the tooling around this is actually a good and bad thing. It's evolving so rapidly, and they change it on an almost daily basis. And it's frustrating if you're a presenter. It's not nearly as frustrating if you're a developer because you're doing your stuff and it's all going to work. It's just moving around. So that portal changes so fast, it just kills us sometimes on it. But it's not changing and messing things up. It's just evolving and getting better. It's a order of magnitude better than it was 3 months ago, just that one screen. And now in Visual Studio in the fall, you're going to have it in the Visual Studio tooling. I'm curious to see what my devs do with that. Are they going to do it through Visual Studio or just kind of continue to do it in the portal? I mean, our environment is Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio depending on, or Eclipse or whatever, depending on what we're doing. There's just so many options. So that was a really bad answer. I like how it is now. It's getting better so fast, I don't want to say anything negative about it. My main frustration has been those 4 or 5 times where I told you, here's how I screwed up the demo because things changed on the Microsoft side. I wouldn't say it's at the awesome level yet. I would say 3-4 months ago, it was really basic, and now it's good. And I anticipate that, being Microsoft, version 2 and then version 3, it'll probably be really good soon. So I'm not upset about it. It's just been evolving so fast, it's a little hard for me to answer. But I'm happy with it now.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what it will be like in 5 years when I get to the new...
Well, 5 years we won't be, who knows what we'll be doing in 5 years.
So like, if we're looking at 10,000 Azure Functions,
Right.
how easy will it be to maintain?
Right, yeah.
Deployment and all this stuff?
Yeah, well, that's kind of for any, I mean, you're a developer, right? You've been in either your own company or customers, and so some of you guys are internal, or I guess I would call them corporate developers. You're building stuff for your company, and then some of you, I'm sure, are consultants or contractors, and you're going to do it through to external companies and all kinds of different customers. One of the cool things about being consulting, which is what we are, is you get to go into so many customers, and you see this much, wow, these guys are bright. And then a lot of times you'll see, these guys are bright, but they're a mess. And then you'll see, of course, the other ones, like, they're not bright and they're a mess. But you really learn so much. And when you see these big architectures, if anything's more than 5 years old, I mean, 5 years ago, none of this was here. They were doing it completely differently. And even if it's a good architecture, once you get 5, 10, 15 years into legacy code, you're just gone. There's just nothing. You have to rewrite it. You have to keep it up to date. So that's another bad answer for you, but that's why our industry's fun, right? I mean, you're always learning, you're always challenged. This stuff is really cool. I mean, it's a guy named Ken Muse, when a guy in that war room 3.5 weeks ago, he's like, I'll just write an Azure function calling the bot service. I'm like, what are you talking about? I literally was like, can you do that? He's like, oh yeah. And I had no clue. I mean, because I'll be honest, so I was a developer for many, many years. Now I fake being a developer. You know, I'm kind of in the management side now, which I resisted for a long time, but then it's just a new challenge. It's been kind of fun. And the Microsoft research stuff and the RD stuff keeps me honest a little bit. Anything else? Yes?
You said that nowadays when you discuss on the architecture, that okay, this is the new thing that you include. I suppose, okay, this is also not a silver bullet, so you probably combine things. My question would be, in how many cases did you, let's say, find this usable? And what would be kind of percentage? I suppose there is some kind of, let's say, standard system, either the legacy, either the something that goes to the container, plus combination with the functions.
I think the question was like how many kind of places or examples have you found it useful, and do you do it by itself or in combination? So I'll answer the second one first. Absolutely in combination. We're not building an app as, hey, there's this big thing to do and it's going to be 1,300 Azure functions at all. But suppose you were doing something that is so the answer to your first question is we're definitely finding it usable. It's still new to us, so I think our main challenge isn't really as much as how do you architect it, as what's appropriate for it. And if you have something exactly like what I showed you, you just want to do this one thing. I'm not trying to do 12 other things with that image file and then do this, that, and the other. I just want to do this. Hey, I already have an Azure app or an Azure thing maybe, or maybe I don't even have everything in Azure, but I just want to do this one thing. It's I don't want to say atomic, but there's a better word for it. It's a simple, reusable thing that does one thing. Now we always think, hey, is an Azure function appropriate? But if you're an architect, you don't want to have something with 85 things in it that you're trying to manage. So one way you can do it is, and you can abuse this, I can have that Azure Function app. We had one function in it. Typically, you'll have more than that. You'll have a bigger context of something you're doing. Maybe it's going to be called content analysis. And one thing is adult content. One thing is security, one thing, something like that. You could have 2 or 3 or 4 of those functions in the function app, okay? So you don't have to have 50 of those function apps. You could have one function app and 2 or 3 or 4. Now you can abuse it. There's already stuff out there when somebody creates an Azure function and it's 2,000 lines of code, or is that now still appropriate for an Azure function? Maybe, maybe not. Is it appropriate of a function app with 35 functions in it? Probably not. You're probably not taking advantage of anything anymore. So you still have to be an architect and think it through. And I'll be honest, I don't, at my management, semi-management level now, I would have my architects up here and see what they think, and so I don't have a really great answer for you. But my answer is still real enough that you have to think about architecture no matter, are you doing Service Fabric, you're doing this, you're doing whatever. That's why I said at the beginning I was curious if any of you guys have been doing it, because I want to learn myself, but still relatively new. It was in AWS well before Azure brought in Azure Functions. AWS had Lambdas. So I'm kind of surveying my friends that do the AWS stuff in Lambdas. It's been around a little more there. But if you read just the news articles on it, you'll hear Lambdas, Lambdas, Lambdas. People are starting to really use it. And I'm curious too. It's one thing to build a workshop level app, a medium-sized app, but then you go into Exxon or Schlumberger or whatever, and you have a million lines of code. What are you going to do with it then? I don't really have all the answers yet, but I'm trying to learn just like you guys are. We're almost out of time, but yes. Couldn't even see you, sorry. Yeah.
Is there a way to do continuous deployment with Azure Functions, like pulling it from GitHub or something?
So one thing, let me show you something. If it's still up, see if I can do it real quick. Yeah, here it is. See these slots? It says preview for proxies, preview slots, and I actually have a slide on an appendix slide on that for you guys. So you can do deployment slots and everything just like you can with, like if you're doing a web app, that kind of a thing. I've never tried personally to build it into the continuous deployment aspect of Visual, when you do Visual Studio and CI and you're doing Visual Studio Team System and doing that whole pipeline. I'm assuming you can, but I've never personally done it, so I want to be careful what I say. But I do know you can already do things like deployment slots and swaps and things like that. It feels like it's the normal stuff. You can deploy it in the fall preview from Visual Studio just like you would deploy a web app. So I'm guessing yes, but I don't want to be definitive about it. I haven't done that yet. So I'm going to start packing up so whoever else comes here next can get in here, but I'll be around and happy to talk. Let me just kind of, thank you.